Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us here at Kingsbridge for today's webinar session. Today's webinar session is going to be talking all around the announcement that we saw back last week with the mini budget. But before we get on to the sort of main contents of the session and some introductions, etc., we'll just wait for a few people to actually join the session. So in that time, I'm just going to go over a few of the housekeeping points so you're well informed about what the session length is, etc., and how you can access the recording afterwards as well. So the session today is planned for roughly 1 hour in length. I'm going to try and not exceed that time slot. And it'll be roughly kind of 35-40 minutes on actually discussing some of those points that we've had come to light last week, as well as leaving a kind of 20-minute portion at the end for any questions that you guys viewing might have throughout the session, or indeed if you have any that you've come to the session with. We're going to be covering a couple of key topics. So the first, of course, is covering what that announcement actually was, what is happening to IR35 reforms, and what this means going forward beyond April of next year. Followed by guidance and advice really for every part of the chain. So on this session today, there is not just contractors, but we've also got members from our end client side, members from the recruitment channel, and of course the contractors as well. We're going to be looking at what things that entire chain really needs to focus on and what it needs to look at, both now, building up to April, and then after April, before looking finally at what HMRC's approach might be, perhaps looking at maybe what that compliance looks like and is there any need to worry either now or in the future. But before we get started, if you would like to ask any questions throughout this session, you should note that on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a small tab that says Q&A. So if you click on that box there, you'll be able to put any questions to us. Questions are monitored by the team over at Kingsbridge, so we'll try and get to those towards the end of the session. We are expecting quite a lot of questions, so apologies if we can't get through them all, but we'll try and get through either some of the most common that keep coming up, or just as many as we can in the time that we've got. At the very end of the session, the team at Kingsbridge will collate all those questions, and we're going to try and put out a post either tomorrow or I think early part of next week. They'll probably shoot me if I've got that wrong at the Kingsbridge side, but we'll try and put something out that basically collates those questions and gets as many of them answered for you as possible. And finally, if you do have to leave the session, or if you've just joined late, there will be a post-session recording that will be sent to you via email, and I think it's going to be accessible by the Kingsbridge LinkedIn page as well. So if you are following us there, it should be posted there. If you're not, then obviously go and find us there, and you'll be able to find the recording afterwards, no problem. So my name's Ryan. I work within the IR35 team here at Kingsbridge. I'm the host of today's session, and I'm also joined by my colleague Andy Vessey, who is head of tax here at Kingsbridge. I'll let Andy introduce himself and give background as to what he does and what his role is here at Kingsbridge.
So just very briefly as background, I started life in the old Inland Revenue back in the 80s, saw the light, jumped ship, went into various accountancy practices, small, medium and large, and then just after the introduction of IR35 I joined Kudos, where I ended up head of tax there, and joined Kingsbridge in 2019 as their head of tax, primarily overseeing the IR35 function and employment status. So I provide advice to the team and outside parties, and just do a lot of consultancy work in the area of IR35. I've defended about over 500 contractors in IR35 enquiries, and then with the majority of those thankfully being successful. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about.
Hope so too, Andy. So we'll get started anyway. So the first talking point here, of course, is that budget announcement, or the mini budget announcement. Do you want to give a bit of context as to kind of what that announcement was and really what we've learned so far?
Well, of course, what Liz Truss did, and which came as a big surprise, because she sort of mentioned IR35 really in passing during her leadership campaign, But what's happened is that the off-payroll rules are going to be scrapped from April 2023, and we're just going back to the old rules. So, the off-payroll rules, I mean, for the private sector, they'll only have been with us for 2 years. They were introduced to the public sector in 2017. I don't really think that anybody can say that they actually saw this coming, particularly as you and I, in our last webinar, we were talking about the off-payroll rules being extended to the small businesses, and we thought that would probably happen in a few years. So this came as a bit of a shock. I didn't anticipate or expect such immediate and dramatic action. And I think when you probably look at it and you think, well, big business may well have lobbied on the grounds that the rules have created unnecessary bureaucracy and they're burdensome. And also, concerns from contractor representatives may well have been listened to. I also think that there might have been pressure from the public sector itself. A number of government departments, they've already been hit with a collective tax bill of 263 million. And that's monies that they could be better invested probably in frontline services. So, ministers might also have been leaning on the Chancellor to relieve departments of that unwanted burden.
And just in that context, then this largely has been received as the correct decision, the right thing to do. I certainly think it's the right thing to do. It's what we sort of spoke about. We sort of spoke about IR35 being reformed in a different way, or with more certainty being given to businesses. As you say, it was only sort of a month or so ago we were sat talking about the promise from this trust to sort of take a look at IR35. So is this the right thing to do, and is this in the long term going to be the right thing to do going forward beyond April and into sort of 2 or 3 years time?
I agree with you, and I think most people involved with IR35 would say the same thing. It reduces the compliance burdens for big businesses, although I think they're going to feel sort of slightly aggrieved that they were forced to, or slightly, probably fully aggrieved that they were forced to invest time and money to deal with the off-payroll rules that lasted a fleeting period. Agencies, employment businesses, they'll be relieved that they'll no longer carry that PAYE and NIC risk, where the end client made incorrect status determinations but took reasonable care. And although the tax and NIC risk has now reverted back to the contractor, I think they'll be more comfortable in that they're no longer at the mercy of end clients who refused to engage with or properly engage with the off-payroll rules. They'll feel that they've got more control, although that they must always take an objective approach to IR35. HMRC, they're going to be frustrated, and understandably, as they feel we're going to go back to something that was broken prior to the off-payroll rules. That's why the off-payroll rules were introduced. In the earlier years of IR35, the inquiry to the ratio of inquiry to contractor population, that appeared adequate. But then when the contracting community increased, inquiries began to decrease, probably because of resources. And inquiries, they fell from about 1,000 per year to around 250 a year. And that was sort of 10 years later. And then in 2010-11, that hit an all-time low of 12 inquiries in that particular year. So you could understand why, obviously, HMRC pushed for the off-payroll rules in the first instance. And when they were introduced, particularly for the private sector, HMRC's target audience that reduced from an estimated 500,000 contractors to around 60,000 end clients and 20,000 agencies. Now that is much more manageable for HMRC. So now they're going back to a system where you've got a large contracting community and they haven't got the resources, to handle that many inquiries. So it's going to be interesting to see what their strategy will be going forward. When these when the repeal of the off-payroll rules were announced, I mean, it's interesting that the government announced it as a deregulation measure. Yeah, and then by that means reduction or elimination of government power in a particular industry. And so they're obviously trying to obviously stimulate, I think, the economy with these measures. Whether that works or not remains to be seen.
Well, I think we'll come on to that at the end as well with talking about what HMRC's approach might be. But so let's talk about the end client and the recruiter space. So what's happened in that space now? What should those end clients and recruiters do between now and April?
Well, continue as they are. The off-payroll rules are still effective up until the 5th of April 2023. And just bear in mind, at the moment, the changes will have to be enacted in legislation, so there'll have to be a finance bill, and then that will have to receive a assent. So although the government's made an announcement that the off-payroll rules are going to be scrapped, until it's enshrined in legislation, it's business as usual. I don't foresee a U-turn like they did with the additional rate of income tax. That was just bad optics, basically. But the Tories are supposed to be a government that encourages entrepreneurship. So I think if they turned on Liz Truss with the off-payroll rules, I don't think that would go down particularly well. Agencies and clients have to ensure that they are following the off-payroll rules as they have been thus far and continue to do so up until at least April 2023. And
I guess quite a lot of that will involve wrapping up a lot of that compliance. So it's not something that necessarily will keep going at the same rate as it maybe was. Perhaps some end clients will stop engaging contractors after Christmas and then wait until the new rules are effective. But what might that wrapping up look like? Is it important for those businesses to carry a kind of auditable process for the future? Like what might that look like?
Well, they have to. I don't think anything changes. The rules are still there. They're in place. Everybody knows what they need to do to remain fully compliant, and they have to remain fully compliant up to April 2023, because. So if the off-payroll rules do eventually get scrapped, if businesses have to bear, an employment business have to bear in mind that HMRC have at least 4 years after April 2023 to carry out a compliance check. Now, I would suggest that they will do that with some of at least the larger businesses, to ensure that the off-payroll rules have been operated correctly. So, okay, it's great news that they're going to be scrapped in April of next year, but that doesn't mean all of a sudden you can just forget about the rules in the next six months, because if you're still engaging contractors, you still have to observe the rules, and if you don't, and HMRC do carry out those retrospective enquiries, you're going to be on the hook.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's been asked quite a lot in the last week or so. It's what might happen to compliance, which again we'll cover off a bit more of that at the end. So just moving on into contractors then. So clearly there's going to be quite a lot of contractors that have maybe been completely new to the market since April 21. maybe some that have closed companies and are coming back to working via a limited company next year, or at least are foreseeing that as being a kind of real possibility. What is it that contractors need to do? So give me a breakdown as, we're in this world beyond April. What should a contractor be doing when they get that contract?
So there's two strands really to IR35 compliance. You've got the contractual arrangements, and then the actual working arrangements, how you work on a day-to-day basis. So those two are very important. The contractual arrangements have actually, because of recent tribunal and court decisions, have become increasingly important, and you just can't ignore them. So with a new contract, a contractor will have to review the contract itself, or have an IR35 expert review it for them, and then consider how that's going to be worked out in practice. Does the contract actually reflect the way that they're working? And then they have to consider those two parts, and then come to it, and then step back and basically say, well, what am I looking at here? Am I looking at a genuinely self-employed arrangement, or am I looking at something really that looks like disguised employment? That's essentially what IR35 demands. So in that process, in part of that compliance process, and it's an obligation, by the way, it's not something that they can just dismiss. They have to consider it carefully. I would probably always recommend, and you probably might say, well, I would say that anyway, to take some professional advice, because IR35 and employment status generally, it's not black and white. There are some areas that are just very subjective. That's why I probably think you probably need some external advice to help guide them.
Yeah, no, I think where we're sort of seeing this quite a lot is obviously those new contractors, or those that have maybe just completely forgotten that IR35 is their responsibility and just left it to the clients and sort of accepted their fate, whatever that was, from April of 2 years ago. Those contractors might be looking at HMRC for guidance, for example, and currently there isn't really a great deal of guidance out there for contractors. Now, I appreciate that there's only 6 months or so until April of next year. Yeah. Are we expecting to see guidance for either end clients, recruiters, or contractors in that time? Because there's not a big window here for HMRC to publish the guidance. When we saw the build up to the private sector changes, there was a robust education process to their credit. But should we expect something similar for contractors in the changes now?
Well, the off payroll, I mean, their education surrounding the off payroll rules, I mean, that was a bit of a departure, really, wasn't it, from the existing rules? So, yeah, that did require an extensive education program. Now we're just going back to the old rules. So I don't think they need something as extensive as they did previously with that. Yeah, there's going to be some guidance, and I think particularly as well because the HMRC might well change their approach to a certain degree. There might be tweaks that HMRC might want to sort of install that we need to be aware of, and we might talk about those later. So, like I say, first of all, got to have that finance bill, got to receive all the, and like you say, I mean, there was only a 6-month window, and guidance will probably follow quickly after that. I don't think it needs to be particularly in depth. Because, like I say, we're going back to the old rules. So, yeah, it's kind of sort of watch this space, really. But generally, I mean, we're all, well, I say we're all probably not those new to contracting, familiar with what IR35 entails. It's been with us, 22 years now. And I think a lot of the existing contracting community, those have been contracting for a good number of years. They're pretty well educated, I think. There's a strong community out there, and there's, so, and obviously, I mean, they share information. So there's a lot of help out there for them, and I say I don't think there's a lot of ignorance out there. Yes, okay, we've talked about IR35 being subjective, and there's always that need for assistance. But I think in general terms, contractors know what's what when it comes to IR35.
And one point that I've certainly seen online in the last week or so is that there seems to be a growing feeling that we're not just going back to the way that it was back in 2016, and that it might be different. Speaking to our clients this week, we've suddenly sort of seen quite a few of them say, well, actually, we are going to be slightly more cautious about how we engage with contractors. Now, importantly here, the status of workers necessarily isn't changing, but the party determining that status is. So clients will naturally, or should, because of this process that we've had in the last 2 years and in the public sector since 17, have a far better understanding of what IR35 is and be more engaged and kind of willing to engage with it. So do you foresee businesses taking not necessarily a cautious approach, but maybe taking a few kind of smaller steps in engaging with workers and making sure that their status is correct with them as of April?
I would hope so, although it isn't necessary for them to do so, of course, and that's what we saw, I think, prior to the off-payroll rules. Many businesses were quite happy to hire contractors, but because it was cost efficient for them to do so for a number of reasons. But when push came to shove and contractors were faced with IR35 inquiries, it was my experience a lot of the time that businesses weren't so quick and keen to actually come to their assistance. Which was a great shame. That wasn't the case with all businesses, but I think a lot of majority of end clients weren't that keen to get involved. That one because they found it time consuming, and it wasn't their problem. I think you have to bear it. There's probably two reasons, and there might be a few more actually that others can think of why end clients might wish to get a little bit more involved in the IR35 process. If they've got contractors, and a good number of them, let's say, and they're all working in a similar fashion, let's say, under a similar contract, similar working practices. Now, if later on HMRC decide that they'd like to have a look at one or two of those contractors and initiate inquiries, it's always helpful. It's something we used to do when I was at QDOS, as you remember, and we had it's either called a confirmation of arrangements or a working practices document, if you like, and it went through all the main issues surrounding status. And we always encouraged, and I would still do so, contractors to engage with their end clients in going through that and completing it together, and then signing it off, and then putting that in the contractor's IR35 dossier. In the event that, should HMRC come knocking, the contractor could present that document to HMRC and say, look, this is how we both understand the contractor and working arrangements. Now, that doesn't stop the inquiry dead in its tracks, but it's a great starting point, and it will actually cut down inquiry time, and it does help expedite investigations more quickly. HMRC will always require end client evidence, so that won't go away, but what it's going to do is reduce the time and the cost to that business, like I say, albeit though it doesn't fully eliminate the burden. The other reason they might wish to get involved is that might want to ensure that the contractors correctly assess their IR35 status in situations where, let's say, the freelancer has deemed the contract to be inside IR35 and they're seeking to negotiate a higher rate, to mitigate the tax and national insurance burden, as we saw with the off-payroll rules, where end clients were actually deeming them inside, and contractors naturally wanted a higher rate. So they actually came out with the same net income.
That's a very good point, actually, one that I've not seen raised yet. And that's will contractors still push back on roles that they determine themselves to be inside of IR35, and will clients be willing to listen if that's to change the role, or if that's to increase the day rate to cover off the difference, obviously. So I will just make the note, we've got tons of questions coming in, but if you have got a question, please do pop it in that Q&A box at the bottom. We'll try and get through as many of them as possible. Andy, just whilst we're on kind of the elements of what may or may not happen for contractors and being involved, etc., one of the questions that has come through is obviously that right now there is the requirement for a contract to have a SDS attached with it. So workers will be receiving their SDSs from end clients currently. We don't know the detail of what HMRC's guidance or what their choices around how this is implemented or is changed in April might be just yet. But could you foresee a world where we have a form of IR35 SDS that the contractor has to produce? It's certainly something which I think seems plausible.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've heard that muted as well within the profession, not HMRC itself. But yes, I absolutely could. I think there's probably a number of things that HMRC might look at in the future to in terms of their compliance. I've already said that their resources, they're already stretched, and to expect them to increase their team to undertake necessary compliance reviews, that might prove difficult. We've already talked about better use of the employment intermediaries reporting, and I think they'll have to do that, so to make sure that they actually properly target IR35 inquiries. Probably we might see more nudge letters, and you might recall, a few years back they did that with GSK. It's a psychological tactic that they use, and that would be used to persuade contractors to classify their status by creating that doubt in their mind. And if they get some success out of that, that's just basically for the cost of a price of a stamp. So it's very effective for them. So I think we'll probably see some of that going on. And as we've already discussed, some IR35 certification, that the SDS, to demonstrate that the contractor, I don't know, maybe the end client, to ensure that the contractor has taken reasonable care to review the contractual and working arrangements. Obviously, the contractor will be responsible to demonstrate reasonable care, but who knows? HMRC, but they could require end client certification as well. Who knows? Anything's possible with HMRC.
Yeah, as we've seen in the past. I would agree with you that I could see it being a possibility that contractors would need to have some sort of IR35 SDS themselves, or something which perhaps the client needs to sign. I don't know. We'll wait and see what the detail of that is when it comes. But even though we are going back to where we were prior to the changes in 2017 and then back in April of 21, rules around IR35 had still not been perfect. I mean, there's tons of different sectors, different bodies, different industry bodies that had been campaigning up until 2017 that IR35 was broken and kind of didn't work then. So for us to go back to that now, it doesn't necessarily feel like a huge step forward, because ultimately people still moaned at what the rules were then. So can you see the same thing happen? Will those same questions be raised about the rule set there, or is this HMRC's chance to kind of get this right for contracting?
it's just not perfect, is it? I don't think whatever you do with IR35, it's never going to be a perfect solution. So I think whatever you do with it, there'll always be some problems somewhere along the line. Unless I think you had that the government produce a proper test for self-employment, that if you do this, this, and this, that you're genuinely self-employed. If you don't, then obviously you are a disguised employee or an employee. But that's been talked about, for a long time, and we've never got to that and never been able to get to that. So until such time, and we either get that, or tax is properly aligned with NIC. And again, that's been talked about for a very long time, and going back at least to when Thatcher's government, for those that are old enough to remember that. We're going to be stuck with IR35, which is so imperfect. But I think HMRC will probably, again, after a while, once they find that they haven't got the resources, to properly police IR35, which is what they were criticised for before the off-payroll rules were introduced. You could see that happening. HMRC telling government, look, it isn't working. We need something different, and then. Perhaps some pressure, media pressure. We've had that before, where contractors have been labelled as tax avoiders for simply operating through their own limited companies. Although I suppose dividend taxation sort of does sort of reduce that sort of gap. I think we could probably expect, in time, some, I think some noise around the fact that the IR35 is not working again.
It's Groundhog Day for some, I think, when we hear that.
Absolutely.
There's tons of questions. So I think, Andy, what I'll do is I'll move on to some of those because they do count into the last section of kind of looking at HMRC's approach as well. So we'll try and cover off as many of those as we can. So the first one really, and again, I'm kind of broadly covering about 15 of these questions at this point. What's the risk for contractors post-April? So what we're narrowing this down to here is, so contractors who have been operating via either a umbrella company or perhaps they've just been inside of IR35 with a client. What's the risk to those contractors post-April? And then we'll maybe cover off after that perhaps what the risk might be to clients and also to recruiters. But let's cover that contractor side first.
So if you've got a situation where a contractor is currently being deemed inside IR35 by their end client, come 6th of April 2023, they're still working for that same end client, and the contractor decides, well, no, I'm not inside, I'm outside. And then HMRC take them up for inquiry. They're going to have to be able to demonstrate effectively that the end client got it wrong originally. Bearing in mind what I've said or touched on with the IR35 inquiries, typically what happens is the contractor gets the letter, provides evidence as to why they deem themselves outside. Then HMRC want to test that evidence. And as part of testing that evidence, the department will always want to talk to the end client or get evidence from the end client. And that's going to pose a particular problem for the contractor, because more often than not, HMRC will put great emphasis on end client evidence, and the end client won't want to be seen obviously not to have sort of been, or they'll want to be seen as to have taken reasonable care over their initial judgment. So you straight away, you've got a problem. You've got the end client saying one thing, the contractor saying another. And that's likely to end, I think, in quite a lengthy inquiry. I mean, prior to the off-payroll rules, inquiries could take, 35 inquiries could take, a couple of years to resolve. They're very time consuming. So I think in those situations, I think the contractor will be well advised to talk to the end client as to whether they can actually reach some agreement as to what the actual status is, or the contractor persuading the end client that their opinion really is the correct one, if you like. And probably that comes back to what we were talking about there about this statement of working practice or confirmation of arrangements, if you like. Yeah, sitting down with the end client and trying to complete one of those and coming to some sort of agreement. Those that have gone from umbrella to PSC, that will depend on the reason that they were working through an umbrella company. They may well have been told in the first instance that it's umbrella or nothing, and in which case they may well have been genuinely self-employed, but the end client just flatly refused to engage contractors. So from that point of view, if they are genuinely self-employed, that's not a massive risk to them. But again, if they were actually really working as or a sort of disguise, they were a disguised employee. I know they're an employee of the umbrella company, but if they can't demonstrate any clear differences between the way they were working under the umbrella as to the way they're working now as under a personal service company. So, for instance, a significant difference would be, if they were afforded a genuine right of substitution, perhaps, and even invoke that. But if there aren't those differences, and they're now saying, well, I believe I'm outside IR35, again, that's going to cause a big problem, because they can't put up that effective evidence to persuade HMRC.
So I can see that there's sort of two questions that I think may have come off the back of the start of that answer as well. But one of the questions that's come in sort of during that is, let's cover off a third scenario. If you're currently outside of IR35 and your client deems you outside, do you have to do anything when it comes around to April? Will you be expected to do anything? Yeah,
you'll still be expected to fulfil your pleasure and compliance obligation under IR35, but it's going to be a lot easier, isn't it? Because your end client's deemed outside IR35, you'll have had the SDS essentially. And if it's just business as usual and nothing has changed whatsoever, then essentially that's going in the IR35 dossier with a note that no changes. There you go. And that's made life considerably easier as well, because you've got end client evidence there in the form of an SDS. Okay, HMRC might want to know that there has been no changes, but I think that's pretty straightforward.
That's a very good point. Yeah, for those contractors who obviously are working outside of IR35 that might worry about their status on the same or current contract post April, then obviously that SDS you've currently got is a good chunk of evidence that you can carry forward. So definitely keep hold of those if you've got them for certain. Just to be absolutely clear, because there is one question that's been asked, and it's just made the point that there is no change in how status is being assessed here, is there? There's no way that you look at status differently. It's just that the responsibility for it is transferring to a different party, just like we've already seen it happen in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's all those status tests that we're also so familiar with. It's the case of applying all those, standing back, and then taking a decision. Yeah, am I a disguised employee? Am I self-employed? So yeah, no changes there.
A couple of very, very quick Kingsbridge related questions. So one of the questions that's come in is, what does this mean, or does this change the IR35 insurance that I've taken out with Kingsbridge? The short answer is no. So the cover that you've got in place with Kingsbridge does cover you for either where you're currently working for a small end client, or whether you're working for an end client who does carry the burden of responsibility of status. So going beyond April, your policy will absolutely still be valid. It will still cover you where the liability sits with you. And indeed, should there be an investigation at any point in the future, then that liability will flex and more or less just cover the party that's deemed liable, depending on obviously which route of inquiry the revenue are going. So I hope that answers your question there. There's another question more or less related to Kingsbridge, and that is, will the Kingsbridge team have a status tool to produce an STS for a contractor post-April? Again, the short answer is yes. We currently have a tool in place that will do that for you. So we're going to be kind of developing that slightly further for contractors as well. So contractors will have the option of coming to Kingsbridge and having a working practice review done via the team, or alternatively, if you have a contract that you want that to be reviewed, then again you can contact us directly, and the team here that's overseen by Andy can obviously go through that contract for you and give you an IR35 contract review to give you some clarity on status. So yes, the short answer is yes, and watch this space, because we'll definitely be putting a lot more out about that shortly.
I think just talking about that, Brian, we spoke about it when we were talking about that confirmation of arrangement stroke statement of working practices. We talked about using our tool and producing an STS to be signed off by the end client as that confirmation of arrangements document, which would be a very convenient way of doing it. Just
to, I guess, flip to a different part of the supply chain then. So we've talked there about the risk to contractors and what that might look like. There's quite a few questions around where the actual liability might sit and who might HMRC come after. So is there a risk for agencies and end clients now? So if they've got workers who are going outside themselves, or inside, or umbrella going to outside post-April, that they may or may not know about? And does that risk only exist up until April, or does it continue beyond April? What's your thoughts, Andy?
So this is the tax and NIC risk to end clients we're talking
Correct.
about. Okay, so yeah, they got it up till April 2023. But I come back to the fact that, okay, that's where the tax and NIC risk is for those 2 years, if you like. But after April 2023, okay, there's no off payroll rules, but they've got to be mindful of the fact that HMRC could actually carry out an inquiry in that 4-year window and look at those 2 years, April 21 to April 23.
And is there any advice that you'd give? There's one question here around what end clients and recruitment agencies can do if they truly believe the contractor should be inside of IR35, but the contractor believes they're outside. Is there anything that the agency can do, or is it just a case of try and persuade them to take proper care over their status?
So this is from April 2023. We're obviously talking about here. Well, the problem is, and I've already mentioned this, is that IR35 or employment status, if you like, there are areas that can be particularly subjective. And you see this, particularly, I suppose, with, that's why cases go to tribunal, isn't it? Or status cases go to tribunal. The taxpayer has got their version of events, and that they've interpreted particular tests of employment status in a very different way to HMRC. So there will always probably be that differences of opinion. it depends really on, on the contractor's stance, I suppose, and also the end client's way of actually viewing it. If you are viewing it objectively, then I'm afraid it's just going to be a difference of opinion. But if it's a case of, let's say, the contractor saying, well, I just don't think I'm outside, just regardless, well, you're not taking reasonable care there. But in terms of what the end client can do, although they might want to, mention to the contractor, we think you're inside. Essentially, I don't really see there's a lot that they can do from that point of view. They are not responsible for determining status anymore. They don't have a tax or an IC risk. It's, like I say, it's other than actually mentioning it to the contractor, I don't think there's a lot more they can do, and there's not more they really need to do, I think. The fact, I suppose, they could say to the contractor, well, I mean, if they really wanted to get involved, is, well, if you're deeming yourself to be outside and the end client thinks you're inside, if you get subjected to a HMRC inquiry, I mean, we can't really give you a lot of support because we always felt you were inside. So your personal service company will actually take the rap for the pay-as-you-earn tax and national insurance contribution.
Yeah, and I think. Sorry, Andy, go on, carry on.
Well, what I was going to say was, because I know you had a question about the Criminal Finance Act.
I was just about to come on to this for you. Yeah,
you carry on then.
So there is a question that we've had that is just on it. I think it's a good time to mention. So, one thing that Kingsbridge are obviously going to be encouraging is that agencies and then clients encourage their workers to take care in respect of status, because that's ultimately taking good measures to make sure the conduct of status is correct from their perspective. Now, one of the questions that we've had come through here is I've heard chat regarding the Criminal Finance Act to contend with. What are your thoughts on this regarding clients needing to have reasonable prevention measures in place to prevent tax evasion in order to reduce the risk of 200% penalties on the underpayment of tax if a PSC falsely claims an engagement is outside? What's your advice for end clients in this situation?
Right. Well, I think you have to remember that that it's necessary, firstly, for a taxpayer to have criminally evaded tax in the first instance. Non-compliance doesn't amount to evasion. Okay, so let's get that right. And secondly, then there has to be criminal facilitation of taxpayer evasion. So what would happen there is, if the two parties were colluding, if you like, so both parties knew they were inside IR35, but they actually say, well, we'll just pretend you're outside IR35. It was absolutely clear, as if that's possible. Well, it is possible that they were inside IR35. That would be a case, I suppose, where the Criminal Finance Act rules could actually come into play. Now, it's going. I do wonder whether HMRC will actually use that as a method to try and improve compliance, particularly where the engagement was deemed inside, but the contractor regards it outside. But I think there is difficulty with it, simply because IR35 is subjective. It would have to be absolutely clear cut, I think, that there was criminal tax evasion involved. I mean, all my time of sort of specialising in IR35, in the cases I saw, I never saw deliberate evasion. So I think it's something to be mindful of. But what I would say is, well, I think we'll wait until we see HMRC's guidance as to what they're going to say. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that HMRC might use it as a tool to try and increase compliance and make life a bit easier for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you sort of said it at the end there as well. You've got to remember that we're going back to a world that once was, and enquiries have always been or been happening since IR35 was introduced. And I've spoke to you on this previously, Andy, and I don't think you've ever seen it used in any of the sort of 550 plus contractors that you've defended. But we'll have to wait and see what happens in the future. Of course, HMRC might change their approach. We don't know what's come out.
Well, you're absolutely right, Ryan. I mean, in the 5+ enquiries I've dealt with, there was a couple of occasions where HMRC tried to impose penalties for carelessness, but they were never able to because IR35 is so subjective. So we always dismissed that and told HMRC that they were wrong, and thankfully they accepted that position. So making that to sort of criminal evasion is quite a leap.
Yeah, or it's very good defence. I don't know. We'll see. So I appreciate we've got 10 minutes left. So if there are any questions that you've got for Andy on absolutely anything, then do pop them in the question box. Again, I'll try and get through as many as I can, but there's sort of up at about 150. So we'll try and collate as many of those in the FAQ sheet after as well. So just the last handful, Andy. Someone's asked a question here of what usually stimulates or generates an IR35 investigation. So more or less, I think what this is aimed at here is contractors might be concerned that what they do might trigger an inquiry post April of next year. What generally will start that process? Is there anything that starts it?
Well, HMRC do have, I mean, with any inquiry, regardless of whether it's IR35 or a corporate inquiry, etc., there's always a risk assessment process, but we don't know what that risk assessment is, and nor should we know, to be quite honest, because if we did, then everybody would be doing, forming their arrangements to, make sure they fell outside of that risk assessment. I mean, HMRC have a number of resources at their disposal. They've got a massive computer system called Connect that drags in information from all over the place. And if you think Big Brother's watching you, that computer really sort of exemplifies that. But we've already talked about employment intermediaries reporting. I think they'll make greater use of that because that's such a useful tool to them to identify those contractors that are outside IR35, and obviously it will help them identify the kinds of yields of tax and national insurance they're looking at. Remember, if bearing in mind they've got limited resources, so the inquiries that they do undertake, they will want a good tax and NIC yield out of it. So there's that. Other than that, they'll be looking. There's the company tax return, the personal tax return. Levels of dividends. So the usual sort of stuff that feeds into that risk assessment process.
There's one thing we haven't mentioned, and I nearly thought we'd get through a session without mentioning it, but it has come through a couple of times as a question. HMRC have obviously got their own tool in the form of CEST. Somebody's asked a question here: is the CEST tool still valid, and would you encourage contractors to use it post-April? Together with a separate question, actually, which is: do you expect any changes to the CEST tool, and should we look out for those in the future?
Well, yeah, the CEST tool's there if you want to use it. It's not just there for IR35. So yeah, it's I've said before, it has a certain use. I wouldn't recommend it because of its shortcomings, particularly on mutuality of obligation. I believe that our tool, and again, you might say I would say that anyway, but yes, I am saying it, is superior, as are a number of other tools out there. So I think CEST will certainly still be valid, and particularly, I think there will be some tweaks to that. or not particularly to do with the tests, because as we've already mentioned, the tests of employment status remain unchanged. That's how we determine status. But if we think that they might move to a kind of certification, IR35 certification, then they might actually build that into CEST. So I think we probably might expect to see a few changes with CEST.
I guess we'll wait and see the detail, won't we, when that comes out in the guidance. But
yeah, I mean, they haven't made CEST, the use of CEST, compulsory. So one would hope that they won't make it compulsory, if they're going to go down a certification process. And you would hope that that they might accept alternatives to CEST.
Perfect. Just a couple of quick fire questions then. This one, I assume, is from a recruiter. What is the agency responsibilities in determining status, if any? Or that might be an agency just asking really about where the fines are, I'd imagine. Is there a world, Andy, where agencies could be responsible beyond April? That's for the tax NI in that scenario.
No, tax and NIC risk is with the contractor from April 2023. It's the old world, So no, it's risk free in terms of tax liability, tax and NIC liability to the agency.
Just your opinion on this next question. Just having a quick read. In instances where a sector has generally deemed roles inside of IR35, do you foresee that this will cause problems for contractors looking to go outside of IR35 in the future?
Yeah, we've already talked about it, haven't we? It's you've got to look at the reasons as to why the end client deemed them inside, and now the reasons why the contractor deemed themselves outside. If both parties have taken an objective view and have been thorough in their determinations, then what you've got there is a difference of opinion, and the arbiter on that is going to be HMRC. And the problem is that they're likely to take the end client's version, unless the contractor can put up some compelling evidence that that really firmly points them to being outside of IR35. And I suppose, just thinking about it, that could be something surrounding the business on own account test that the end client wasn't aware of.
I appreciate we've got about a minute left, so I'll try and wrap up absolutely on time. But the last two questions, the first one we've got, how do we access your tool? So Kingsbridge does have an IR35 assessment tool. We've got a contractor version and a end client and an agency version. The contractor version obviously is going to be much more important to those workers as of April of next year to look at their own status. Kingsbridge will send out both to this audience and to our wider contracting audience just a few details on how you can access it. More or less what it gives you, and some details about how you can talk to us about that outcome that you might get afterwards as well. So I'll let all that come out in the detail afterwards. But yes, we absolutely have a tool that you can access and use to assess your own status. And the final question, Andy, I think it's actually quite a good one to sort of wrap up on. This question is, do you know when the guidance is scheduled to come out from HMRC? What might we look out for? I appreciate that as a crystal ball that I'm asking you to look into, Andy.
It's a short answer. No, if any further announcements are made later this year, you might get it later this year, but I would really expect it to be probably next year sometime. And like you probably alluded to, it's likely to be shortly before 6th of April of next year. I would imagine. There's obviously they'll talk about the obligations now fall into the contractor, and that there's no longer going to be any obligations for end clients and agencies. And I would have also probably expect I'm going to be more interested in what they say if anything, about their compliance approach, bearing in mind everything we've just talked about?
So that does take us nicely to the end of the session. So thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar today. I hope you enjoyed the session. I've got some insight from Andy. We are going to be running separate sessions for contractors, so it's purely going to be contractor focused, the same for clients and agencies. So do look out for the information that we're going to send out on those. But as of today's session, you will get a recording sent out to you afterwards. And like I say, we're going to try and collate as many of these questions as possible into one place where we can answer as many of them as we can. So I think just from both of us here today, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you on our next session very, very shortly. Thank you.